Okay, and we are continuing with part 2 of this book. So I just named it To Be. And we are going to go into the chapter of where Kerth saw like 3 films that were they're very graphic. Again, I have to warn you, if you are a squeamish person, don't like to hear any of this type of blood and child killing kind of stories, and I am just warning you, this is where I am going with this. This is what is in this book. And we are going to start off with film number 1. So Bob is the one that basically Kerth is saying is the one that he respects. He's a Satanist also. He's also a filmmaker. So he was like a filmmaker for these satanic Luciferian societies. And these are some of the films that he showed to Kerth. The first film I'm going to describe was in black and white and no sound. Oh, it had sound. It was a high quality film, but sometimes the sound was tiny, and occasionally some images were out of focus. The first part of the film was in a large kitchen. I remember that in the start of the film, it seemed as if the cameraman Bob was trying to bring it into focus and set the camera up in a fixed position. As the camera was being juggled briefly behind the cooks, you could see one of the kitchen windows out into a parking lot where a classic limousine was parked. After the images became steady, the camera was focused on a large table. This was inside a clean upscale kitchen, which was very spacious. The 2 cooks were women, all dressed in white hairnets and aprons. One was short and chubby, while the other was tall and thin. They both smiled cheerfully throughout this film. The shorter cook brought in a white infant child who was male. I'm not certain of his age, but my guess is that he was at least 4 months old, maybe older. She placed him on the table and played with him. He seemed cheerful and smiled some. The other taller woman then came up from behind him and carefully slit his throat with a straight razor. The blood spurted out across the table, staining the white linen tablecloth. His eyes rolled up, and he died almost instantly. Quickly, they carefully held up the dead infant so that his blood drained into a large pan. Then they brought out a large cutting board, set him on it, and began to remove his internal organs. They placed the internal organs into large, shiny pots. They used a small metal saw to cut off the infant's feet and hands. They carefully removed his head. Then they stuffed him with what looked like breaded stuffing. After that, they placed him in a large baking pan. They did all of this quickly and with practiced skill. All during this process, they were cheerfully explaining what they were doing and why. After they set aside the pan and pots they had used for the boy, they brought out a small black infant girl. I remember that she seemed more active than the boy. She was laughing as the cook played with her. I remember that at one point she seemed to look right into the camera and giggled. They killed her and prepped her corpse in the same way as they had with the boy. After that, they took the pan with the girl in it and all of the pots off the table. Then they held up the blood-stained tablecloth in front of them, presenting it as if it were a beautiful work of art. One of them said, "We're going to save this as a remembrance. Look at this. Isn't this lovely?" There was another segment of the film done in the kitchen from a different angle. You could clearly see 2 large ovens of the sort that you might see in the kitchen of a restaurant. The cook, still grinning, carefully placed the 2 dead infants in the oven. The taller cook faced the camera and explained what temperature the ovens had been preheated to and how long it would take to cook the infants. Then she explained the basting process. I remember that she spoke very properly with a distinct British accent. The next section of this film was set in the dining room. At the beginning of this section, the room was empty of people, and the table hadn't been set. During the process of adjusting the focus on the camera, it was possible to see out of one of the windows onto a large yard with trimmed bushes and white statues. After he got the camera set up in the way that he wanted it, Bob himself could be seen in the picture, closing the curtains and fooling around with the lights. While he was doing this, he was talking to somebody else off camera who was giving him advice. The camera had apparently been turned off for a while after that because the next shot, the table had been all set with lace tablecloth, fine dishes, silverware, napkins, cups, and glasses. The guests all came in, cheerfully making small talk. Maids and butlers hovered behind them. The guests were dressed in fine clothing. Everyone was wearing party masks, which covered their eyes but not the lower part of their faces. There was a balding man who wore horn-rimmed glasses over the mask in a way that looked almost comical. The host and hostess showed everyone where to sit. The host made a special point of showing a young man and his wife where to sit at the end of the long table. He explained to them that he had the camera set up especially so that they could be clearly seen in the shot. They asked why they were being filmed. The host explained that since they were both now his new friends and the man was now his newest employee, he wanted to film this special occasion, which was being to celebrate their new relationship. I remember that the young man's name was Doug. Anyway, Doug expressed his gratitude for the job and for having been invited to the party. Everyone else at the table seemed cheerful and comfortable. However, Doug and his wife seemed nervous and out of place because of the way that the camera and microphone had been set up. I could clearly see their faces and hear everything they said. The host and hostess sat on the other end of the long table so that their backs were to the camera. Once thus seated, you could really only see the sides of their faces from that angle. There were 12 people altogether at the table. I think that it was 6 men and 6 women. Most of the guests avoided looking directly at the camera, but Doug's wife would occasionally look directly at it to smile nervously before shyly looking away. The host explained that because the two of them were guests for the first time, they were going to have a special meal. He explained that it was going to be a special type of pork, very rare and delicious. Everyone at the table laughed loudly when he said that, except for Doug and his wife, who looked confused because they didn't understand the joke. Throughout the dinner, the hostess gracefully instructed the servants with brief comments and gestures. Various courses were served before the meat course. There were appetizers and fancy vegetable dishes before the meat was served. When the meat was brought out on the silver trays, it had been sliced thin so that it wasn't obvious what it actually was. The guests all seemed to be in the joke, except for Doug and his wife. Stuffing was served with the meat. Everyone spoke in exaggerated voices about how delicious the meat was. Although the meat all looked the same, some of the guests made jokes about which was better, the dark meat or the light meat. Not understanding what they were really referring to, Doug said that he thought that only turkey had dark and light meat, at which point everyone laughed at him again. Doug and his wife seemed confused as to what the joke was about, but politely laughed along with everyone else. Doug and his wife ate a serving of the meat and commented on how good it tasted. At that, the host insisted that Doug have a second serving. Doug replied that he didn't want to make a pig of himself and that he was full anyway. But the host insisted, so more meat was put on his plate while the other guests giggled. The butler attempted as well to put more meat on the plate of Doug's wife, but she resolutely refused, claiming that she had to watch her figure. The amount of meat put on Doug's plate seemed larger than what he wanted, but he quickly cut it up and gobbled it down. As he did this, a woman sitting near him put her hand over her mouth and giggled almost fanatically. Doug's wife glared at this woman with a suppressed look of perplexity on her face. After that, dessert and coffee was served. As the guests ate, the host began to lecture Doug in a booming voice across the long table. It was apparent that Doug was a new employee of some kind and was being trained by the host to be an executive. The host was stressing the importance of being ruthless as an executive. He said that Doug needed to start thinking of the general public as cattle. He said things like, "No one respects a soft hearted executive. You have to understand that the general public are really just peasants, and the peasants are merely cattle to be herded. I don't want you to be a leader of men. I want you to be a cattle herder. You're an aristocrat now. You're one of us now. You have to think differently about them." As the host spoke, the other guests looked at him respectfully and nodded, listening intently. After the lecture, the table was cleared and the hostess announced that she had a surprise for their new friends. She said that she hoped that Doug was a good sport and didn't mind a little practical joke had been played on him and his wife. She said all this with a voice that was very sincere and good humored. She then signaled the servants that they brought in 2 silver platters with a domed silver covers over them. These were set out in front of Doug and his wife. When the butler removed the covers, Doug and his wife could see that they were looking at the disembodied heads of 2 infants. Doug's wife immediately put her hands over her face and started to weep slowly. Her hands trembled and her body shook slowly. At first, Doug seemed unable to take in what he was looking at. He said, "Are these doll heads? They look so real." Everyone at the table was laughing in what seemed like a good-natured way. They seemed affectionate in the way they were looking at Doug. Suddenly, taking in the fact of what he had just eaten, Doug stood up, knocking his chair backwards. He threw up immediately on the floor. He then looked up at the host with a look of trepidation on his face and apologized, but the hostess insisted that he mustn't worry, that they weren't upset with him. In a kindly voice, she said that he was family now and that he shouldn't be afraid of them. A butler appeared almost instantly with a broom and dustpan to clear up the vomit. A woman sitting near Doug said, "What's the matter, my dear? Don't you like long pork?" At that, Doug's wife went from crying to laughing. She sounded manic. She stood up and said, "Now I get the joke. Ha ha, you chaps are so funny." A maid brought out a silver bowl and a glass of lemon water. Doug rinsed out his mouth and spit into the bowl. Then the man with the horn-rimmed glasses came around to where Doug was and put his arm around the young man's shoulder. I remember that he spoke with a crisp British accent. And with real affection in his voice, he said, now, don't be upset, my dear boy. Your host have played this little joke on everyone. Like you, I spilled my cookies the first time I had long pork, but now I have a real taste for it. This is just our way of making you welcome to the club. You're one of us now. Now that you've passed this little initiation, things are about to become much better for you and your lovely wife. After that, the platters with the heads were moved to the center of the table, and the cooking pans with the butchered corpses of the infants were brought in and set on the table as well. You could see the infants' ribs where the meat had been carefully cut off. After that, the host proposed a toast. All the dinner guests stood up, and glasses of wine were placed into their hands by the servants. Then the host made an affectionate toast to Doug and officially welcomed him into his organization. Still looking slightly bewildered, Doug and his wife accepted the toast, and with faint smiles on their faces, they drank the wine, and that was the end of the film. Bob, who had been commissioned to make this film, secretly made extra copies of it. He showed the film to other people without having permission from the host or the committee. I saw the film several times myself. I was shown this film in Bob's home back in the 1970s. The special effects technology which existed back then would not have been able to fake what I saw. These images of the infants being killed and cut up were close up and vivid. The camera was in focus while the infants were being prepared for cooking. It was real. This was something that really happened in the world. And these people are freaking evil, man. I cannot stress that enough. This is the film part 2. The second film I'm going to describe was also in black and white. It was shorter and not made as well. The sound was on for only a part of film. Toward the end, it cut out for some technical reason. This film had been made a year or so after the first film was made. Bob had to explain some things to set up this film. The dinner host in the film was the same man as in the first film. I don't recall his name, but I do remember that Bob identified him as a member of the committee. This man believed that if you commit acts of true evil, Satan will reward you with power in the world. His trick of getting his new recruits to eating long pork was an act of evil, but these people had all converted to Satanism before he had subjected them to his joke. Doug and his wife were shocked when they found out that they had eaten flesh of a baby, but they had already renounced Christ and begun to worship Satan. The Illuminati leader wanted to do something more evil than that. He believed that if he could trick the mother into eating some of the flesh of her own newborn infant, it would be a monumental act of evil for which Satan would reward him with great worldly power. So this Illuminati leader spent a great deal of money and time to set this up. And this, once again, this is very, very graphic. Before filming this dinner, Bob heard the story from the man. Through agents, he found an unwed pregnant woman who was young and unemployed. Her family had deserted her and she was homeless. While living on the street, her leg had been badly broken. She had been placed in some type of hospital, but her leg wasn't properly set. While convalescing there, she had been contacted by a man who claimed to work for a charitable organization which had been created to help women in her plight. She was set up in a modest apartment and all of her expenses were covered. Because of her accident, she couldn't walk right and needed to be pushed around in a wheelchair. A private doctor had been arranged for her. When the time came to have her baby, she was taken to a house near the mansion of an Illuminati leader. After her child had been born and she had recovered from the birthing process, she had been invited to go to the home of her benefactors for a fancy meal. This second film didn't show the infant being killed and prepared for cooking. There were no shots taken in the kitchen. It was filmed in the same dining room and at the same angle. The guests in the film at first seemed much more somber and they weren't wearing masks. As I observed this film, it seemed to me that the same dinner guests whom had been in the first film were also in the second one. Doug and his wife were there and she looked more plump than in the first film. The mother in her wheelchair was pushed in the room by a butler. She was set up at the head of the table. She politely asked why their dinner party was being filmed, and the host gave the explanation that he had just bought a new camera and wanted to test it out to see if it worked. She accepted that answer and then went on to profusely thank him for all the help she had been given. He seemed to accept this praise graciously. At this point, nobody was making any jokes, and they all seemed somber. The mother asked to see her child and wanted to know why the servants had separated her from her baby. The host explained that the child was being well cared for by a nurse. He said that they wanted to get to know her better without the distraction of a baby. She seemed nervous at hearing that, but said nothing in reply. The meal proceeded exactly as it had done in the first film, except that there was no joking. When the meat course was brought out, the hostess apologized for the small portions, saying that it was a rare delicacy. The mother seemed reluctant to eat the meat, but the hostess was so insisting that the mother finally complied. She gingerly took small bites of the meat and showed no satisfaction in doing so. At this point, the sound in the film cut out, so the rest of the film was silent. After the meal, the butler brought out a silver platter and a larger cooking pan. The platter and pan were uncovered, exposing The platter and pan were uncovered, exposing her infant's head and butchered corpse. When the mother saw this, she was immediately shocked. She instantly realized that she had just eaten the flesh of her own now dead child. She became hysterical. She tried to get up out of her wheelchair, and a butler came up behind her and pushed down on her shoulders. Even with the sound off, you could tell she was screaming. You could also tell that the host, hostess, and all the guests were laughing at her reaction. She began to weep. At one point, she picked up the infant's head and held it in her arms. She glared at the laughing aristocrats. I don't claim to be able to read lips, but she seemed to be saying the same thing over and over. I think she was saying, "What kind of people are you?" That was all of the film that I could stand to watch. Bob explained that after that, they wheeled her off and killed her. Bob was no saint. In fact, he was a very immoral man. He hurt many people. He wasn't a high-ranking Illuminati member. I would say that he was probably a well-connected mid-level Illuminati member. But his mother was a high-ranking Illuminati member, and so he had social connections, which made him an insider. One way that he served the committee was by making films for them. He had filmed many strange rituals, animal sacrifices, and even human sacrifices. He prided himself on being so jaded that seeing things never upset him. But even Bob was disturbed by what he had filmed that day. I saw this film only once, but that was enough. I felt that there was an intelligent presence which emanated pure malevolence through the film media. At the time, I felt that I had been given proof of Satan's undeniable existence as an invisible yet tangible force from another world. Very, very sad. Okay, and this is going to be the third and last film. The third film that I'm going to describe to you has to do with a Satanist who practiced cannibalism as a type of sexual stimulant. This film, the one that I saw, this was a short one. It was in black and white. I don't remember any sound. It was of a woman being kept prisoner in a room. She was chained up on a table. Periodically, men would come in to rape her. Sometimes they would immobilize her and then in a surgical manner remove parts of her body. These they would eat in front of her. This was an extreme form of sexual sadism. After torturing her in this way, they would become sexually aroused and then rape her. The woman in the film was missing some fingers, a foot, and some toes on her other foot. Skin had been systematically skinned off from parts of her body. One breast was missing a nipple. So she was being slowly consumed alive. I cannot even imagine. Oh my God. There was a hot plate in the room where they could cook some of the woman's flesh in front of her before eating it. The hot plate was also used to make a nice blade red hot. Sometimes they would burn her wounds and stop the bleeding, apparently to keep her from dying too quickly. I remember that in the film, before torturing and raping the woman, a man took a disembodied head of another woman out of a refrigerator and showed it to the woman on the table, who was yelling something in response. In the film, I remember that a man cut off a finger from the woman and then burnt the finger's stub with a hot knife. Then he raped her while chewing on the severed finger, which he had just cut off. Throughout the film, the woman had a look of extreme despair on her face. There were bruises and scars all over her body. There were a number of men in the room. They were all nude. They laughed at the woman's suffering. They passed her severed finger around and each took turns chewing on it before raping her. These are just demons. That's all I could say. I mean, just demonic possessiveness of people. Oh my goodness. From what Bob told me, the woman had been systematically tortured and raped over a period of weeks. He said that she had been starved and forced to drink the men's urine and to eat the feces. When she had been fed real food, it had been rotten or wormy. Bob explained that this type of organized torture and rape of a woman was not just for the purpose of sexual sadism. He explained that this was all part of an executive training program. This wealthy Satanist trained his executives to be ruthless in dealing with his employees and with the public. This torture, cannibalism, and rape of an innocent woman was a test of sorts. If any man wasn't able to participate in this, then he wasn't qualified to be an international corporate leader. So it was a test for psychopathy as well as a test for sadism. Its purpose was to psychologically condition business executives to treat the public in general as objects. The men participating in this torture and rape of an innocent woman had been brainwashed to suppress any natural empathy which they might feel for their fellow human beings. What I have seen and experienced has led me to believe that the recruits of certain Luciferian secret societies are encouraged to commit acts of cruelty to animals and humans. And this is done for calculated reasons. This is like boot camp training where a soldier is being trained to kill the enemy. And to the members of these Luciferian secret societies, the enemy is anyone who isn't one of them. So this is how they view us. For more than a decade, Bob made films for the committee, made copies of them in secret, and then showed them to others. In the 1980s, the committee found out what Bob had been doing. When they realized that he had been showing these films to people who hadn't been authorized to see him, they were very displeased. They killed him in a way that was very painful and humiliating. Originally, his goal had been to reform the committee. In the end, he realized that it was a mistake to try to reform the Illuminati. Although he was an enthusiastic Satanist for most of his life, he came to ultimately realize that the Illuminati needed to be deconstructed because it can never be reformed from within. Although some aristocrats in the Illuminati system may cooperate in the destruction of the Illuminati, they can't really reform the system from within the system. The idea that you should join the system so that you can reform it simply doesn't work. Because once you are initiated and a full-fledged member, you are so powerless under the control of the group's leaders that you can't. This irrational addiction to power by the highest ranking Illuminati leaders is at the heart of all this corruption. One reason blood drinking is used by such person is that it can create the delusion of feeling powerful. And on that, I'm going to stop there. I'm still reading, I'm rereading this book. So if anything else comes up, I will do a third video on this. If not, if you're interested in, of course, if you're interested in this book and interested in wanting to learn more, then I highly recommend that you buy Kerth Barker's books. He has a bunch of other books. I have like 2 other books by him that I have not gotten into. But like I said, this stuff is very, very graphic. It's very, very real. And it is, once you start understanding everything in the world and how it relates to occult, satanic, government ties, then you understand a little bit more. You have a little bit more of awareness than a regular person who doesn't believe in any of this stuff, doesn't know that any of this stuff is going on, or doesn't want to believe that any of this stuff is going on. I will be bringing out military white papers, and in their own words, this will be in their own words of the stuff that they are doing. And I will enlighten y'all with that information. Once again, thank you for watching the Esoteric Page and Film Symbolism channel. And I will see y'all again later. Thanks.